Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality. Hello and welcome once again to the Living Out podcast. It's really good to have you joining us. Co-host Ed Shaw is skiving today because he's apparently speaking at somebody's wedding. But I'm really pleased that Andrew Bunt has taken his place. You might remember Andrew from the very first episode of this podcast. So it's great to have you, Andrew. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you. It's lovely to be back on the other side of the microphone or the other side of the Zoom call today. So it's nice. And how are you, Anne? I must ask that, I know.
Yeah, Ed always forgets, so thank you.
I would
thank
never
you,
forget.
Andrew. I'm very well. I've just been playing with my cat, so I'm feeling nice and relaxed, which is great. Yeah, he was a lockdown purchase. Anyway, it's this series is all about meeting Living Out authors, people who've contributed to the website and written things for us. And we're really excited today to have international speaker, best-selling author, podcaster, all-round good person, Preston Sprinkle. Welcome to the show, Preston. Great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm excited about the conversation.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. And you're coming to us from all the way across the Atlantic, from the USA. Whereabouts?
Yeah, I'm living in Boise, Idaho, and most Americans don't know where Idaho is. So if you don't know where that's at, don't. There's no offense taken.
I haven't got a clue. It's a big country, isn't it?
It's sandwiched between Montana, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, up in the kind of northwest corner-ish, but not on the coast. So, yeah.
Okay, so mountainous area, is it? Or,
yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. Lots
Sounds
of mountains.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Good for holidays.
Oh yeah.
So when you're not doing all this stuff that Andrew's going to talk a bit more about your work in a moment, but what do you like to do to relax?
Oh yeah. My family and I, we love to. We're pretty active, so we like to go hiking. We like to camp, fish. In the wintertime, we all my kids ski and I snowboard, and then we love to travel too. If we have the funds to do it, if we have, as we say, two nickels to rub together, we'll be on a plane somewhere if that's possible. So COVID has stunted that a little bit, but we managed to get away. There's certain places. So
fantastic.
So, Preston, I know you've been thinking and writing and teaching in the whole kind of area of sexuality and gender for a number of years, and you're now the president of the Centre for Faith, Sexuality and Gender. Can you just tell us a bit about the ministry that you have been and you are now involved in?
Yeah, so the center, we started it in January of 2017, so just over 4 years ago, and we started it as a resource to help Christian leaders to navigate the conversations around specifically LGBTQ related questions, to help them navigate that conversation with theological faithfulness and courageous love. So those are our kind of twin pillars. We want to help create help leaders create a context, a culture in their church or ministry context where people who are wrestling with their sexuality can do so without being shamed. Can do so with the proper pastoral and relational care they need, and to kind of change the tone of the conversation. And then also, I'm a theologian by trade, so I love the academic side of this conversation. I think there's a lot there, and so we want to help equip pastors with, help them understand, a deeper theology of marriage, singleness, and why did God even create something like sex, in marriage and these things. So, and to be able to respond to some critiques of a traditional sexual ethic, and the gender conversation that raises all kinds of questions about anthropology and body-brain relationships and so on and so forth. So, we want to equip pastors with those kind of questions too. So, theological faithfulness, courageous love. Primarily, we do so through resources, online resources, written resources, but also we do a lot of live training events as well throughout the country. Again, all this is pre-COVID, so it's been largely an online ministry the last year or so. But it's been quite the wild ride.
Brilliant stuff. And you mentioned your academic work. You were over here for your PhD, it's right, in the UK.
Yeah, I did my PhD at Aberdeen University from '04 to '07, and then I even taught for a semester at Nottingham University. That might have been the highlight of my life right there. I was teaching at Nottingham University. I'm a PhD student in front of all these students, and that was fascinating. So, yeah, we had 2 kids born in the UK. We very much feel almost more at home culturally in many ways in the UK for various reasons.
So you started in academia over in the UK. What's the journey been from there to now being the president of the Centre for Faith, Sexuality and Gender? How has that kind of change come about?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, I started in academia, and even though I'm not naturally academically wired, I just fell in love with studying. I just couldn't. When I became a Christian, I couldn't stop studying. Like they had to pull me out of the library. Hey, it's closing. But I wasn't naturally very intelligent, so I felt like early on I was able to bridge that gap between kind of the average person in the pew and the academic world, and so I always said I either wanted to be a pastoral theologian or a theological pastor. For me, it didn't really matter. I want to help people follow Jesus more faithfully, and I love to read articles that nobody likes to read, and and I think both are important. But then I started writing books that seemed to deal with controversial topics, so they tell me, and they were written more not to fellow academics, but to the average person, in the pew. And I loved that space. I loved just writing in normal language, and yet having a gazillion footnotes at the endnotes at the end. So. Naturally, that took me into the conversation of sexuality and gender because, that's something that everybody was asking questions about. And so, I'll say the long story short, I just transitioned out of teaching to doing this full time.
And how have you found it? How have you found it as a straight married man, kind of working a lot in areas of sexuality, gender identity? I can think of lots of pastors I talk to who often are straight married people, and they're quite nervous about engaging in this conversation because they don't have personal experience. How have you found it from your perspective? And I'd love to know, people often think there are disadvantages and are nervous about doing it. Have you found any advantages of your own personal experience and then you speaking into this conversation?
Because I've been in it for a while, this is all I've known for a while, it just seems normal to me, but I think, even before I started writing and speaking pretty much full time on sexuality and gender questions, I love to see blind spots in the Christian faith, or not the Christian faith, but like how the church is going about certain conversations. And we have a few blind spots, and this one was just glaring to me. Like when I started doing research into the theology of same-sex relationships, I just was horrified at how evangelicals, and specifically American evangelicals, were going about this conversation. They were saying things that were just blissfully ignorant and shaming people without even. Sometimes they don't realize it. Sometimes they did and they didn't care. And I remember meeting, interviewing a lot of gay and lesbian people, and the unanimous response I got from all of these people that I was talking to was, "I've never met a Christian that was kind to me." I'm like, how is that? Then you've never met an actual Christian. Like, that doesn't make sense, And so I think I just quickly realized how our tone was so bad, and how we went about the conversation. And then there was a lot of just theological ignorance, and maybe it was part of, I started off on, being really active on social media and saying things and, pushing people's buttons. And I'd get people that would just like quote Romans 1 at me as if I've never read Romans 1. I'm like, so this is how you go about the conversation. You do know that every single gay person has this verse memorized in Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, Coptic, they've been beaten over the head with it. You just think quoting the verse is going to do something here. And that's like, so it was almost like psychologically, it was like going to the zoo. Like, I'm like, in what world do you think this is like thoughtful and helpful? And so I just saw wide open, like, man, I think Christians need help to really understand this conversation better, that's so politicized. And then on an academic level, I started reading, affirming, theology, and people are like, oh, you got to read this book. This shows that the traditional view is just totally wrong. And I'm reading this stuff thinking, wow, this is convincing to you. Like, did you check the footnotes? And, and so I saw on in almost an equal way, like a great need for more responsible, I guess, theological work done. And the ones that were doing what I would consider maybe more responsible theological work, again, their tone was like just hideous. And so, to me, it was just like there's a huge need for somebody to have a much, much better tone, to actually understand as best they can LGBT people, and also be theologically responsible in how they're approaching it. And I don't want to say that there are, you guys, I'm speaking to people who have done it well, and obviously, Ed and Sam and there are others out there who are doing good, Wesley Hill and others.
I think what you've done, that you've highlighted some things I so value about what you and the Centre do, your books and different resources, the real focus on people. I remember reading People to Be Loved, Preston's book on sexuality, and as a rare experience of reading a book about sexuality, thinking, this guy doesn't know me, but I think he loves me, I think he cares about me. And thinking, no, you've seen the people behind the issues. Yeah. And so often it is the issues, or they're seeing as just issues, when actually this is real life experiences and people. And I think that, and just the way I think you spoke about earlier, the Centre, you seek to combine just, I can't remember the word to use, but the truth and love, and you do that so kind of wonderfully. I so value that and the work you guys are doing. And I think that for me was one of the reasons your latest book, Embodied, Transgender Identities, the Church and What the Bible Has to Say, has been so helpful. And I am openly declaring it as my go-to resource now on a kind of Christian view on trans, because it does that thing of, no, how do we engage with reality for real people? How do we bring both the truth and love of God? Do you want to tell us a bit more about that specific book, kind of why you've written it, how you help it be a blessing to people who read it?
Yeah, thank you. It was the most challenging thing I've ever done was the book, my recent book, Embodied. You've read it, so there's so many different, just on an academic level, so many different disciplines that require like a specialty in each individual discipline, and all of them are important to putting together this whole kind of puzzle of what it means to be human and male and female and embodied and so on. So that alone was hard. And then to get the tone right, because I think Christians are doing a better job with the LGB side of the conversation. I think they're getting it. I think it's pretty rare in my world, at least, as somebody doesn't know somebody who's gay and is like, oh, they're pretty normal, like, yeah, imagine that. But the T is still scary for a lot of people. There's nothing scientifically suspicious about somebody saying, hey, I'm attracted to the same sex. Like, that raises questions of maybe sexual ethics and so on, but no one's going to say, like, how dare you even say, But when if somebody claims, and I'm not saying every trans person is going to say this, they don't, but if somebody does say, I'm a biological male, but I actually am a female, that raises questions like, well, help me understand that. Let's set aside the Bible for a second. I'm just wondering, like, how is that even a possible truth claim? So it does. I think there are some statements that seem very outrageous within the T conversation. And again, I'll emphasize it one more time. Most of those statements are coming from a very small minority of some very activist types that the average trans-identified person is just trying to get through the day without self-harming. I mean, they're dealing with sometimes some really severe gender dysphoria, and there's a lot of complications going on in their journey, and we need to be sympathetic to that. But the T conversation can be extra, like people are extra nervous about it, I think. So trying to write this book in a way that addressed all of the conceptual questions that arise in the conversation, to do that well and responsible, that alone was difficult. But then to do it with a tone that is going to humanize somebody who is wrestling with their gender identity, who isn't an activist, and isn't trying to change bathroom laws. They just have to pee in public, and they're trying to figure out how to do that without freaking people out. So that was really, really difficult. And I realized, you mentioned my book, People to Be Loved, which was on homosexuality. That came out in 2015. And I realized that this conversation is very, very different than the trans conversation. Because some people say, wow, you wrote another book on that. Didn't you already write that book? I'm like, there's about a 1% overlap between these two books, because they raise such different questions. The one commonality is most LGBT and T people have felt dehumanized and shamed by the church. And so there is a posture, a tone similarity there. But beyond that, there's so many different questions that come up. So I'm like, man, so once I finished People to Be Loved, I was like, I need to focus solely really on the trans conversation. It was a really challenging book. But I'm glad you like it, Andrew.
No, brilliant.
You're listening to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality. For more stories, resources and events, visit our website at livingout.org. Preston, you've written a couple of articles for the Living Out website, and we're really thankful for that, because just what you were saying about the conversations being quite different, it's quite interesting because, Living Out has become a sort of go-to place for people to ask questions about transgender as well as same-sex attracted type questions, and I feel very ill-equipped to answer those. So I just want to thank you for starters for just helping us to think through things in a sensitive way. You've written a really helpful piece called 5 Things Every Christian Should Know About the Transgender Conversation. And your first point is something that we've been talking about, that trans people are people, not issues. And it's so easy to sort of get caught up in the political and campaigning side of things, isn't it? I wonder, how can we sort of counsel church leaders and church members in being more compassionate towards trans people? How can we help people actually do that in practice?
Yeah, great question. And I do want to acknowledge, I should have acknowledged this earlier, but to acknowledge, I guess, the obvious, we've mentioned it, but as somebody like myself who does not identify as trans, does not wrestle with gender dysphoria, this does put me at a disadvantage. I do have that creates a distance between me and the topic. And so everything I say is always me as an outsider kind of trying to understand trans people. But the best way to understand trans people is not just to go to me or read my book, but to actually talk to trans people. So that would be where I'd start. I mean, honestly, and I think COVID has really hindered this, because now we're all locked down. We're inside our homes. What do? We start looking at social media, news articles, and almost everything online is designed to say the most extreme thing, use the most extreme example, take the most extreme voice. And it can give the impression, again, that, the kind of radical trans activists who's saying the most provocative thing, that represents trans people. And that is simply not true. Get to know people who are wrestling with gender dysphoria. Get to know people who identify as trans. And you'll see that, as Mark Yarhouse says, common ministry partner between us, if you've met one trans person, you've met one trans person. And so don't let that trans activist be the only lens through which you understand the trans conversation, especially if you're a pastor. There are people, look, if you have 100 people in your congregation, there probably are a few people who are wrestling with their gender identity. People in our congregations are wrestling with just all kinds of stuff, whether it's related to the trans experience or not, that they're just they feel so ashamed to even talk about it. And so get to know people and talk about this conversation with a tone that's going to draw people out and say, man, I feel like this person might be a person I could talk to that's actually going to love me through this thing that I'm wrestling with, So yeah, that would, I mean, I could keep going on that, because that's such a huge issue, but yeah.
I think that's really important, what you've said about sort of building relationship with people. I mean, I guess some contexts might be easier than others. If you're in a sort of big urban church, you're probably going to come more into contact with people. I'm thinking of some of the contexts here and thinking, I don't know how you would even meet somebody,
Yeah.
And I guess as well, there's a role for church leaders to establish a culture where people can be honest about what they're struggling with and feel welcomed and accepted. How would you sort of deal with the tension between loving people and accepting them completely, and also maybe having the slightly more ideological discussions?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking of trans friends that I've got who, because I love them and they're 100% accepted and they know that, it can't compute the fact that I might have a different perspective on.
Yeah.
Even though we've had conversations about it, they find that hard to wrestle with.
In a sense, this is even a broader question about how do you have a genuine, loving relationship when the other person kind of needs a lot of ideological agreement in order for that relationship to happen. And in the States, as you know, looking on from the outside, our political situation's an absolute nightmare. I know really solid Christians who said, well, I couldn't be in a church if a Democrat, or I couldn't be in a church with a Republican, or if I knew there's somebody in my church voted for Trump, I couldn't be. Like, wait, so your unity around Jesus isn't enough. Like, you need, this is a bigger issue of like, even if you see somebody else is just really, different, can you still be in a relationship with them, even if there's ideological differences here? And in some cases, I don't know if there's an easy answer to that. Like, yes, in some cases, somebody, maybe they're trans, maybe they're not, might need almost comprehensive agreement for them to be in relationship with you. And with the trans conversation, it's not just ideological agreement; it's very personal, obviously. Yeah. So if they are believing certain things about themselves that you disagree with, hopefully we can all at least understand that could be really difficult for some people to handle, Now I do think so. One of my trans or non-binary identified friends, I asked them this question. I said, well, what about, and I was nervous asking it almost. I'm like, okay, but there is this scientific reality that 99.99% of people are either male or female. Like Homo sapiens are a sexually dimorphic species. Earth is round and not flat. Humans are sexually dimorphic. This isn't really my perspective. Like, this is just an observation on, is it okay for me to kind of like tell somebody that if they don't believe that? And my friend, it was really great. They said, yes, that's absolutely fine. But are you just lobbing some truth grenade from a distance, or are you walking with the person in a relationship? Is it within the context of a relationship? Is it clearly because you love them, or is it because you just want to correct them? And I thought that was really helpful, and we all know that where that line is. Are we just wanting to win an argument, or just trying to show somebody that like, can't you see this, or are you actually committed to them in the long journey of a relationship, so that when we do start maybe voicing some ideological, maybe disagreements or tensions, it's truly out of a committed relationship in love. And that's not always easy.
I think that's wonderfully wise, isn't it? And I think if we're in danger of going one way or the other, I think we're definitely not in danger of being too compassionate and listening to people too much at the moment. So that's really helpful. It's interesting what you were explaining a little bit there about sort of different experiences of transgender. I think a lot of Christians like me are just quite ignorant on the whole thing, and we don't understand the kind of range of experiences and also the difference between transgender and intersex, which is something I wanted to talk about as well, because the other article that you've written, intersex and transgender identities, is really helpful. And I have to say, I didn't really know anything until I read that. So perhaps you can explain to listeners a bit about how kind of intersex, what it is, and how it sort of comes into play when people are making arguments about how many biological genders there are.
Sure, yeah. So intersex is a more of a colloquial term given to a range of medical conditions that medical professionals will call either disorders of sex difference, DSD, or the slightly more politically correct term is differences of sex development. DSD covers them both. And intersex is kind of the broad term given to those various conditions. Now, there are anywhere from 16 to 20, or I've even read, in the mid-20s of different kinds of these medical conditions. Most of them are very minor, and the symptom might be some very, very, very minor atypical feature in somebody's anatomical sex, to the point to where they may not even know they have an intersex condition. In fact, there's a good number of people who find out maybe in their 30s, oh, I didn't know I had a condition that was technically classified under the intersex umbrella. So if you add up all of the kind of people who might have an intersex condition, it's been estimated about 99% of people with an intersex condition are clearly either male or female. So the idea that intersex means not male or female, therefore sex is not binary, therefore gender is not binary, therefore there's a whole range of different identities that exist in between male and female. Like that line of logic has taken a fairly significant leap at every turn. But that happens in with people with PhDs all the time. Really smart people will use that leaping logic, and it's really unfortunate because at the end of the day, you get the sense that people are sometimes using the concept of intersex as an ideological argument, or an argument and to push kind of an ideology. And it's like, well, that's and some intersex people like Clara Graham in the UK and others, are kind of crying out saying, can you stop using me in your ideological wars? Like, I am a person. I'm intersex. I'm female, and stop saying that I'm neither one or the other. Intersex is a medical condition within somebody's biological sex. Trans is not that. Trans has to do with some kind of psychological incongruence between a person's body and their mind, but there is no ambiguity in whether they are male or female, unless the trans person also has an intersex condition. And even then, 99% of them would still be either clearly male or female. So, the logic that even with intersex, though, that really doesn't prove that sex is not binary. Like, you have male and female, and then you have a really small percentage of intersex people who might be a blend of both. And I've got friends that are both male and female, but male and female are still the only two sex categories. And that I think that's an important distinction. It's not just semantics. Like, sex is not a spectrum, and there's books written that try to say that. It's like, I wouldn't want that person operating on me in the ER if they really think that sex is not binary. Like, again, this is not a radical statement to say that male and female are the only two sex categories. Now, when people say gender is not binary, then that opens up a whole new discussion. What do you mean by gender? You ask 10 different people what gender means, and you'll get 11 different responses, sometimes in, the single sentence, Gender often refers to the psychological and social aspects of being male and female, whether you resonate with your biological sex, or whether you fit into the cultural stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. And oftentimes when people identify as trans, or especially non-binary or gender fluid, they're really referring to, well, it's built into the term, right? They're referring to this gender aspect that I'm clearly male or female. I just don't resonate with that. Or I don't fit into the stereotypes, which is typically what a non-binary identity means. That I don't think masculinity and femininity are the only two options, and I don't resonate with either one completely. But that does raise the question of, somebody might be a guy and like sports, or not like sports and like art. Does that mean he's not a guy? So I am nervous about how some of these identity markers unintentionally do kind of almost resurrect and prop up some of these gender stereotypes that I think we should work to not moralize or sanitize and try to stuff everybody in these masculine and feminine boxes. But
I think that's one of the things I really enjoyed in your first article, that you did talk about gender stereotypes and how a lot of them are unbiblical, actually, and you picked some examples of how the Bible has a much more kind of refreshing view of masculinity and femininity, what it means to be a man and a woman. So I think sometimes the church is a very poor reflection of that. Men have to do sporty things, women have to do craft or baking or whatever it is. Just finally and very briefly, how do you think the church can get better at helping people to sort of more healthily express what it means to be a man and a woman of God?
Yeah, great question. And this one of the beauties of the trans conversation is that it's raised this broader question about gender stereotypes that are applicable to everybody. It's true that most biological males will probably naturally resonate with many masculine stereotypes. Okay, that's on a statistical level, more than 50% will probably go in that direction. But we can't make it an absolute. We can't moralize it. First of all, we can't therefore say it's morally right for a male to act masculine, a female to act feminine. Like there's nothing in the Bible that does that at all. In fact, it would be you would be on the side of the Pharisees if you explicitly or subtly really make these categories of masculinity and femininity moral. Like if you unintentionally make a female feel less female because she's not very feminine, that is a fair. Now you're adding to kind of God's expectations, and that's a dangerous place to be. And yet the church does that all the time. So I think, honestly, I mean, it sounds cliche, but I think just read the Bible. Look at the range of male and female experiences in the Bible, and it's a beautiful thing. I think the Bible upholds the fact that there's two biological sexes, and we are on a general level different. On a biological level, we're very different. But there's a lot of overlap and flexibility in what it means to live out that male and female sexed identity, and I think people can find freedom in the church when the church recognizes that flexibility. I don't know if you guys have, you have men's and women's retreats, don't you, at your churches? At least in America, man, these sometimes men's and women's retreats can be a cesspool for gender stereotypes. It's just so, and I know a lot of non-trans people, like guys that are just not very sportsy, that they're like, I'm going to sit this one out because they're made to feel like they're not a man when, everybody's out playing football, whether it's American or British. There's out, being rough and hitting each other or like kicking the ball or whatever. And it's like I would rather honestly work on some lyrics in my newest song, but I'm made to feel like that's not manly if I did that at a men's retreat. That's terrible. I think people mean well. I don't think people realize it, but I think we need to open our eyes to the expansive vision for what it means to live out our male and female identities in the scriptures.
I mean, King David was pretty hot on song lyrics, wasn't he?
He did some good ones, that King David.
He's
classics.
He is a classic. That's really fascinating. We could carry on talking for hours about all sorts of things that we've raised. We've run out of time for this podcast, but I suspect we will have you back and talk more because it's been an absolute delight. Preston Sprinkle, wonderful to have you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you to everybody who's been listening. Do subscribe to make sure you don't miss any of our future episodes. And if you feel like chucking a good rating in our direction, we'd very much appreciate that. You can read Preston's articles that are on the Living Out website and lots of other articles, resources, videos, animations at livingout.org. Bye for now.